There are homes where love is loud, and there are homes where love hides behind fatigue, behind sacrifice, behind everything no one has the courage to say. This is the story of a family who mistook silence for survival until one moment forced them to finally listen to each other. This is the silence we called home. Step into a world of wonders with Tales with Jenny. Don't forget to subscribe and click the like button. The city woke up before the sun, as it always did, coughing itself alive with the sound of engines, shouting conductors, and radios arguing with the morning. From the narrow street where the family lived, the air carried the mixed smells of petrol fumes, fried akara, damp dust, and last night's rain that never fully dried. Outside, life was loud and impatient. Inside their house, it was different. The walls were thin, but the silence was thick, layered and heavy, like something that had been deliberately stored there over time. The ceiling fan turned slowly, clicking at intervals, pushing warm air from one corner of the room to the other. Chairs remained where they had been left the night before, untouched. Shoes lined up by the door like people waiting to leave but unsure if they should. This was a house with people in it, but it no longer sounded like a home. It breathed quietly, cautiously, as if afraid that making noise would wake something painful. If silence had an address, it would have learned this one by heart. Kunle moved through the morning like a visitor who didn't want to disturb anyone. He dressed quietly, button by button, his shoulders already slumped before the day had even begun. The mirror in the corner reflected a man who once laughed easily, whose voice used to fill rooms without effort. Now his eyes avoided their own reflection. He didn't look tired in the dramatic way people talked about exhaustion. He looked worn thin, like fabric washed too many times. He checked his phone for messages that never came, slipped it into his pocket, and sat on the edge of the bed for a moment longer than necessary. He wanted to say something to his wife, to the house, to the morning itself, but the words felt too heavy to carry to his mouth. Silence had become easier. It asked nothing of him. It did not question his failures or demand explanations. When he finally stood and stepped outside, the door closed softly behind him, as though the house understood and agreed that nothing needed to be said. Aisha woke fully after he left. She had heard the door, of course she heard everything, but she pretended not to. Lying still, she stared at the faint crack on the wall above her, the one that had been there for years and somehow never spread, just like the things she refused to talk about. Her body ached in places she could no longer name, the result of long days, short nights, and worries that refused to rest. She rose and began the morning routine with practiced precision, sweeping, wiping, heating water, arranging plates. Her movements were efficient but joyless, like someone completing tasks without expecting reward. She remembered mornings when the house smelled of laughter before food, when questions were asked freely and answered honestly. Now, even her thoughts were careful. She loved her family fiercely, desperately, but love had started to feel like something she carried alone, a weight she couldn't put down without everything collapsing. So she smiled when necessary, stayed quiet when it mattered, and told herself that holding things together was the same as being happy. Silence stood beside her in the kitchen, watching, never correcting her. The children woke into the quiet as if it were normal. Zainab stayed in her room longer than necessary, scrolling through her phone without really seeing anything, her headphones resting unused around her neck. She had learned that speaking often led nowhere, that questions returned unanswered or were postponed until they no longer mattered. Her thoughts were sharp, restless, full of things she wanted to scream but didn't trust anyone to hear. Tunde, smaller and softer, moved through the house like a careful guest, adjusting his steps to avoid noise, watching faces instead of cartoons. He sensed tension the way children do, not with logic, but with instinct. He noticed how voices lowered when he entered a room, how conversations paused and never resumed. Sitting on the floor with his school books, he glanced around the house and wondered, in the quiet way children wonder, if this was how families were meant to sound. Outside, the city roared on, impatient and alive. Inside, the house listened to its own silence and called it home. By midday, the city had fully claimed its voice. Heat pressed down on rooftops, tempers flared at bus stops, and time moved with the impatience of people who could not afford to slow down. Kunle stood among other men waiting for work that might not come, his shirt already clinging to his back. Conversations buzzed around him, complaints about fuel prices, jokes masking frustration, loud laughter that ended too quickly, but he remained quiet, nodding when necessary, smiling without commitment. Inside him lived a constant calculation. What could be postponed? What could be ignored? What could be endured one more day? He thought of his family often, not in moments of peace, but in sharp flashes of worry. School fees, rent, food, the future he once promised but now struggled to recognize. Each thought came with words he never spoke aloud: apologies, explanations, fears, but he swallowed them like bitter medicine. Somewhere along the line, silence had convinced him it was safer than honesty. A man who spoke his weakness risked losing respect. A man who endured quietly was called strong. So Kunle endured, unaware that the cost of that strength was slowly emptying the house he loved. At home, Aisha's day unfolded in fragments of responsibility. Neighbors came and went, asking questions she answered carefully, never revealing too much. She listened to other women complain about their husbands, their children, their lives, and she nodded in understanding while hiding the fact that her own pain had no clear shape. It was easier to complain about money than loneliness, easier to talk about exhaustion than disappointment. When she was alone, the quiet pressed closer. She found herself standing still in the middle of a room, unsure why she had entered it, her thoughts drifting back to memories she had packed away. There was a time she believed marriage meant sharing everything, the good and the unbearable. Now, she rationed her words, afraid that speaking honestly would sound like accusation. She loved Kunle, but love had become something she protected instead of expressed. She told herself that sacrifice was part of being a good wife, that silence was patience, that patience was virtue. Still, there were moments, small, dangerous moments, when she wondered how long a heart could stay quiet before it forgot how to speak. Zainab carried her silence differently. Hers was sharp-edged, restless, and full of questions no one seemed ready to answer. At school, she spoke when necessary, laughed when expected, and learned quickly how to keep her real thoughts to herself. She watched her friends complain about parents who were too strict or too involved and felt a strange envy. At least their parents noticed. At home, she moved between rooms like a shadow, present but unseen. When she tried to talk, it felt as though the words bounced off invisible walls. Everyone was tired. Everyone was busy. Everyone said later. Over time, later began to feel like a lie. She stopped trying. Silence became armor. Anger became quieter but heavier. She told herself she didn't care, that independence was strength, that needing people only led to disappointment. Yet late at night, when the house settled into its familiar stillness, she imagined a version of her family that talked freely, that argued loudly, that cared without hesitation. The thought hurt enough to make her turn away from it. Tunde's silence was the smallest, but it listened the hardest. He paid attention to pauses, to the way adults stopped talking when he entered, to the sighs that came too quickly and the smiles that didn't last. He learned to read moods the way other children learned games. He kept his worries simple, unspoken, neatly folded inside him. When he was hungry, he waited. When he was scared, he prayed quietly. He believed that being easy to care for would make life easier for everyone else. At night, lying on his mat, he replayed the day in his head, wondering if he had done anything wrong, if there was something he could fix by behaving better tomorrow. The house seemed so big when it was quiet, full of spaces where voices used to live. Outside, generators hummed and neighbors argued and laughed. Inside, the silence grew comfortable in its place, settling deeper into corners, into habits, into hearts. None of them knew it yet, but the things they never said were gathering enough weight to eventually bring everything to a stop. Evenings in the city always arrived exhausted. By the time the sun slipped behind the concrete skyline, the roads were still loud, but the people were spent, carrying the day on their backs like unpaid debt. Inside the house, the air felt heavy, as though it had been holding its breath since morning. Aisha moved around the kitchen on instinct, reheating food she had cooked earlier, stirring without tasting, listening to the distant noise of generators and passing vehicles instead of the thoughts pressing against her chest. Zainab stayed in her room longer than usual, scrolling through her phone with tired eyes, delaying the moment she would have to come out and sit at the table where no one really spoke. Tunde finished his homework quietly and sat on the floor, knees pulled close, sensing the tension the way children do not with words, but with instinct. When Kunle finally arrived, his steps were slow and uneven, his greeting barely louder than a sigh. No one asked how his day went. He didn't offer. The silence opened its arms and welcomed him home. They ate together, but it felt like 4 separate meals happening at the same table. The television murmured in the background, filling the room with noise that required no response. Plates clinked softly. Chairs shifted. Kunle barely touched his food, his face drawn, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for water. Aisha noticed she always noticed, but fear stopped the question at her lips. What if asking led to an argument? What if she sounded ungrateful? What if it made things worse? Zainab watched the scene with growing frustration, anger rising quietly inside her. Someone should say something, she thought. Someone should notice. but years of being unheard had taught her restraint. Tunde felt his chest tighten. He watched his father closely, the way children watch storms, hoping they pass without damage. The house grew quiet again, thick and uncomfortable, as though it sensed what was coming and didn't know how to warn them. It happened without drama. Kunle pushed his chair back slowly and stood, his hand brushing the edge of the table as if searching for balance. For a moment, no one reacted. Then his legs gave way. The sound of his body hitting the floor was dull, final, terrifying. Time seemed to fracture. Aisha froze, her mind refusing to accept what her eyes were seeing. Zainab screamed his name before she realized the sound was coming from her own mouth. Tunde rushed forward, small hands shaking, heart pounding so hard he thought it might break his ribs. Neighbors poured in, voices overlapping, panic filling the space where silence had lived for so long. Someone shouted for water. Someone else called for help. Aisha knelt beside her husband, calling his name again and again, tears spilling freely now, her voice cracking under the weight of everything she had never said. Silence had promised protection. Instead, it had led them here on their knees, begging for time. The hospital was too bright, too clean, too unforgiving. White lights buzzed overhead, stripping the night of softness. The smell of antiseptic clung to the air, sharp and cold. They sat together on a hard bench, closer than they had been in years, but shaking with fear. Aisha clasped her hands so tightly her fingers ached, as if pain could keep her present. Zainab stared at the tiled floor, counting squares she would forget later, guilt and fear twisting inside her. Tunde pressed himself against his mother's side, gripping her wrapper, afraid that letting go might make something worse. When the doctor finally approached, his face carried the tired honesty of someone who had seen this story too many times. He spoke gently, but his words landed hard: severe exhaustion, prolonged stress, untreated blood pressure. Then he paused. That pause was heavier than the diagnosis. If he keeps living like this, the doctor said quietly, the next collapse may not give you time. Aisha broke. Not loudly. Not dramatically. She folded inward, shoulders shaking, tears soaking into the fabric of her clothes. Every moment she had chosen silence over concern rushed back to her. Every question she swallowed. Every night she pretended everything was fine. Zainab felt something inside her crack open. All the anger she carried suddenly felt small compared to the fear of losing him. She realized painfully that her silence hadn't protected her heart, it had only delayed the hurt. Tunde finally whispered the question he had been holding all along, his voice barely more than a breath. Daddy will wake up, right? Behind a thin curtain, machines hummed steadily beside Kunle's bed, doing what the family had failed to do, listening, responding, keeping him alive. In that sterile room, surrounded by strangers and blinking lights, the family understood the truth too late, but not beyond hope. Silence was not strength. Silence was a slow kind of loss. And they had almost lost everything. Morning crept into the hospital without permission. Pale light slipped through narrow windows, revealing tired faces and a night that had refused to end. The bench felt harder now, the air heavier. Aisha had not slept. She had not cried again either. Something in her had gone still, like a cup filled past its edge that could no longer take another drop. Zainab sat beside her, shoulders hunched, eyes swollen from holding back tears she did not trust herself to release. Tunde dozed in short, restless bursts, waking each time a trolley rolled past or a door creaked open. Somewhere behind a thin curtain, Kunle lay silent, surrounded by machines that spoke for him now. The family waited not just for him to wake, but for something else they could not yet name. When Kunle finally opened his eyes, it was not dramatic. No sudden movement. Just a slow blink, like someone returning from a long, painful thought. Aisha noticed first. She froze, afraid to hope too quickly, afraid that naming the moment might make it disappear. Kunle, she whispered, her voice trembling as if it hadn't been used in years. His eyes found hers, confused, tired, ashamed. Before she could stop herself, the words came pouring out, not loud, not angry, but raw. She told him how scared she had been, how lonely, how tired of pretending she was strong enough for both of them. Tears slid down her face freely now, unchecked. I needed you, she said softly, and I didn't know how to say it without sounding like I was complaining. Kunle tried to speak, failed, and closed his eyes briefly as if absorbing the weight of her truth. Zainab stood at the foot of the bed, arms crossed tightly over her chest, fighting herself. Part of her wanted to stay quiet, to keep the armor she had spent years building. But another part, bruised and trembling, was tired of being unseen. I felt invisible, she said suddenly, her voice sharper than she intended. Everyone turned to her. The room seemed to hold its breath. I stopped talking because it felt like nobody was listening anyway. I thought if I needed less, it would hurt less. Her voice broke on the last word, and she looked away, ashamed of the tears now spilling down her cheeks. I didn't know silence could hurt this much. Kunle stared at his daughter, shock and regret washing over his face. This was not the child he thought he knew. This was not the pain he believed he was shielding them from. Tunde climbed onto the edge of the bed carefully, small hands gripping the sheet. He did not understand everything that was being said, but he understood enough. I try to be good, he said quietly, eyes fixed on his father. So nobody will worry about me. The room broke open at that. Aisha pulled him close, sobbing openly now. Kunle turned his face away, tears slipping from the corners of his eyes. In that moment, all the silence they had carried, the swallowed fears, the postponed conversations, the unasked questions came crashing down between them. It was painful. It was messy. But it was real. And for the first time in a long time, the house they would return to no longer felt like a place where silence lived. It felt like a place where healing, fragile and uncertain, had finally found a voice. Recovery did not come all at once. It arrived slowly in small permissions. The doctors spoke about rest, medication, changes that could not be postponed anymore. Kunle listened quietly, nodding, no longer pretending that endurance alone could save him. When the doctor left, the room fell into a softer kind of silence, not the dangerous one they had lived with for years, but a careful pause, like people learning a new language. Aisha adjusted Kunle's pillow, her movements gentler now, no longer rushed by fear of saying the wrong thing. She asked how he felt and waited for the answer instead of filling the space. Kunle hesitated, then spoke honestly. "I'm scared," he said. The words came out rough, unfamiliar. No one laughed. No one judged him. The room held the truth and did not break. They talked in fragments at first. Short sentences. Long pauses. Aisha admitted she had been angry without knowing where to put the anger. Kunle confessed how heavy shame had become, how every failure felt like a verdict on his worth. Zainab spoke carefully, choosing her words like glass, afraid they might cut someone. She said she wanted to feel like she mattered, not like an extra responsibility in a house already overwhelmed. Tunde listened, swinging his legs gently from the chair, absorbing more than anyone realized. When he spoke, it was simple. "I like it when we talk," he said. That sentence settled into the room like a promise. No one rushed to respond. They let it be true. Leaving the hospital felt different from arriving. The city was still loud. Traffic still argued with itself. Vendors still shouted into the heat. But something inside the family had shifted. Kunle walked slowly, leaning on Aisha's arm, accepting help without apology. Zainab stayed close instead of drifting ahead. Tunde held his father's hand tightly, not out of fear this time, but connection. They did not suddenly know how to fix everything. Money was still tight, worries still waited, but they had learned something important. Silence was not the price of love. Speaking did not mean failing. It meant staying. That evening at home, the house felt unfamiliar in a gentle way. They sat together without the television on. Conversations stumbled and restarted. There were awkward moments, unfinished sentences, laughter that surprised them all. The silence returned at times, but it no longer felt like an enemy. It felt like rest. For the first time in a long while, the house was not holding its breath. It was listening. And in learning to speak without fear, the family discovered that healing did not require perfection, only honesty, practiced again and again. Morning returned to the house without tension. The sun slipped through the curtains gently, touching walls that no longer felt guarded. The city woke as it always did, buses coughing to life, vendors calling out prices, radios arguing about the day, but inside the home, the noise no longer felt like a threat. Aisha moved through the kitchen unhurried, humming without realizing she was doing it. Kunle sat nearby, resting, his body still healing but his spirit lighter than it had been in years. Zainab lingered longer at the table instead of disappearing into her room. Tunde talked freely, his small voice filling spaces that once belonged to silence. Nothing about their lives had suddenly become easy, but something essential had shifted. The house was no longer holding its breath. They learned slowly that healing was not an event, but a practice. Conversations didn't always go smoothly. Sometimes words came out wrong. Sometimes old habits tried to return. But now they noticed. They paused. They tried again. Kunle learned to ask for help without shame. Aisha learned to rest without guilt. Zainab learned that her voice had weight, that it mattered even when it trembled. Tunde learned that love did not require silence or perfection, only presence. They laughed more, argued honestly, and forgave quickly. The house responded to them, warming in ways that felt almost alive, as though it had been waiting patiently for them to remember how to live inside it. In the evenings, they sat together more often, not always talking, not always laughing. Sometimes just sharing the same quiet without fear. Silence no longer felt like absence, it felt like peace. The city outside remained restless, unforgiving, loud. But inside the walls of their home, something steadier had taken root. They understood now that love was not something assumed or endured. It was something spoken, shown, and chosen daily. They had almost lost each other learning that lesson. They would not forget it. This was the silence they had been searching for all along, not the kind that hid pain, but the kind that held understanding. The kind that came after truth had been spoken and hearts had been heard. And in that gentle, hard-earned quiet, the family finally realized home was never meant to be where silence lived. It was meant to be where voices returned.